Hello, I'm Paul METZGER, and I'm here with my friends who are Latter-day Saints and a fellow evangelical to discuss the theme of religious trauma and resilience. And it's for our science grant through the American Association for the Advancement of Science that comes through Templeton, the Templeton Foundation. And we've done a variety of forms, but this one is on religious trauma and resilience. And I'm really delighted and honored to be with two Mormon leaders, one from Brigham Young University, J. Spencer Fluman, and also Ed Stone, who's a local leader here in the greater Portland, Oregon region. This is why everyone should come to Oregon to live, because this is a daily reality. This kind of sunshine, no rain, that's a lie. It's a total lie. This is just one day among 365 days. Very few. This is trauma for me, the rain in the Pacific Northwest. But anyway, so Mr. Ed Stone and then also John Moorhead. And I'm going to ask them each to introduce themselves here for you at this time. Ed?
Yes. Yes, Paul had mentioned that I've been a leader for the LDS Church here in the Portland area for some years, and I've had an opportunity recently to get acquainted with Paul METZGER, and we've become close friends, I think.
Yes.
And there has been religious trauma between our two communities historically, and we are looking forward to this opportunity to see if we can find ways through understanding and civil dialogue to break down the necessity to have trauma every time we get together and try to have a conversation. So.
Thank you, Ed. John?
John Moorhead. I'm the custodian of the Evangelical Chapter of the Foundation for Religious Diplomacy, and I'm also here during this time in the Portland area. I've been working with a grant project team funded by the Louisville Institute called Multi-Faith Matters, and Paul has been a part of that with some other team members, really to help evangelicals learn how to engage people in other religious traditions in respectful and civil ways. So I'm pleased to be a part of this conversation today.
Good. Spencer Fluman from Brigham Young University. I'm the executive director of the Neil A. Maxwell Institute for Religious Scholarship and an associate professor of history there, and I study American religious history. So I'm grateful to be able to engage a topic like this that's complicated historically and in the present. And I've spent over a decade in LDS evangelical dialogue as well. So I count some prominent evangelical thinkers and writers among my friends and fellow travelers. And so I think it's a timely conversation.
Thank you. And as I had mentioned, I'm Paul METZGER, and I'm the director of the Institute for Cultural Engagement, New Wine, New Wineskins at Multnomah University and Seminary. And we're going to take part in a forum tonight that is for the Portland area. It's maybe the first of its kind, and maybe a little bit more on that later. But now for the discussion. So I'm going to be asking my friends to respond to the historical discussion here as we outline our two movements, and I feel more comfortable speaking about my own movement's history with trauma and resilience, and I'll leave it to John to speak to that as well, and then Spencer and Ed will talk about Latter-day Saints and their history as it relates to trauma and resilience. But I think we would all agree that when we think of the Christian faith, when we think about the source of our traditions, our founder, Jesus Christ, talk about trauma. I mean, nailed to a cross, crucified under Pontius Pilate, under the Roman government, crucified, dead, buried. Yes, he rose from the dead, resilience, but talk about trauma. And so our movements are bound up with this theme of trauma and resilience. And a Zen Buddhist priest said to me just the other day, we don't have that kind of history as Buddhists like you do for Christianity, because we don't have that with our founder, the historical figure of Gautama. He experienced the trauma of others as he went outside of his palatial community, but he personally did not have that kind of trauma. He wasn't crucified. But so that takes us back to the very beginning. We could talk about the history of Christianity with the persecutions that occurred throughout the centuries, but I want to take it up to the present day and really the 20th century, 21st centuries. And with the 20th century, I'm thinking here of, for evangelicals, the Scopes trial. As George Marsden, the great historian, evangelical historian, has said, you cannot underestimate the impact on the fundamentalist evangelical psyche when it comes to the Scopes trial, because that trial and our marginalization, in our minds at least, from the greater Christian community and society at large, where we felt polarized and pushed out of the public square, we've been trying to regain that ground ever since, so to speak. Going back to Dayton, Tennessee, the trial that while evangelicals, conservative evangelicals, those who were in support of creation against evolution, won the trial, so to speak, it was a Pyrrhic victory because culturally it was a great loss and we were looked upon as being hillbillies and who were not at all really about rational discourse and rigorous engagement on key pressing issues. And so that takes us back to where we as a movement of evangelicalism come out today. And so it was not to be associated with liberalism, not to be associated with the broader terrain of religion and the like. And so to have interfaith or ecumenical discourse was seen as capitulating even to the enemy. So ecumenical dialogue was seen as very, very problematic. So just as evangelicals have faced trauma and feeling marginalized by the society as a whole back in the 20s onward through the 20th century, even to the present tense, we're the largest movement religiously in North America or in the United States, but we still feel at times as if we're a persecuted minority, and some of that historical phenomenon with the Scopes trial comes into play. I'm asking Spencer if you would share a bit about your own history and the founder of your movement and beyond, how you may have experienced trauma and such.
Well, you used the phrase, Paul, a persecuted minority, and I think that encapsulates the first couple of generations of Latter-day Saints in the United States and their mentality. The founding narrative for Latter-day Saints is one of kind of alienation from the broader culture in which the church was founded in the 1830s. By the 1840s, they had been pushed from one community to the next in a constant kind of forced migration westward. Ultimately, when they left the United States in 1847, they felt completely alienated from their kind of fellow countrymen. In fact, I had in mind, there's a bit of a poem by one of the early Latter-day Saints, and in it she wrote, it just came into my mind, she wrote, let us go to a far distant shore where the bloodthirsty Christians will hunt us no more.
Oh my goodness.
And it kind of viscerally kind of communicates, her name was Eliza Snow, and she was one of the most kind of literary gifted early Latter-day Saints, and she was able to voice in that phrase that sense of disconnect that they felt. And so the
very visceral.
The murder of the founding president of the church, Joseph Smith, and his brother in Illinois in 1844, and then the forced exodus across the plains. For Latter-day Saints, this kind of formatted a sense of isolation, alienation, insularity. That's powerful stuff around which to become a community, but those can function as easily as walls to anybody on the outside. And in some ways, modern Latter-day Saints still live in the shadow of that period of violence and confrontation. And sometimes, as a historian, I joke that Latter-day Saints have a couple of modes, and one is to engage and to reach out, and the other is to kind of go into a bunker and to feel like to almost expect others to misunderstand or to misrepresent. And those can be difficult patterns to break. And so I think that's kind of woven into the Latter-day Saint cultural DNA in a way, is that a kind of painful history. Yeah.
When I think of what you're saying, Spencer, there's a lot of similarities. For all the difference between our two movements, there's a lot of similarities. And, you know, trauma like that from outside can cause us to gain resilience internally. But as you were saying, we can become so insular that it's always us against them, even when we're doing missionary work. And both our movements are very missionary oriented.
Yes, absolutely.
But it's a matter of, is it really like we go out, throw a hand grenade, and then, you know, a spiritual hand grenade out there, and then go and try and get them back to the fortress? And I think that kind of fortress mentality, there's resilience, but there's a lot of trauma that we as evangelicals have had, and I think it still carries on today.
Paul, if you take a little tour, you take a little driving tour through Utah, and you drive through some of the older communities in Utah and see some of the historic Latter-day Saint temples that are from the 19th century. If you look closely, they're all encapsulated. They're literally castles. And more than one architectural historian has noted that these are pretty interesting symbols of resistance.
Fascinating.
They literally are fortresses. If you look at them, their architectural cues are obvious, and that kind of fortress mentality really, I love the way you said it. I think that's a powerful way of understanding the LDS past, at least. Yeah.
And we have that too.
I think that what Spencer's talking about with the challenges that the church faced in the 18th century with Joseph Smith and Brigham Young and the travels across the plains and the trouble with the government coming into the state and so forth. As a people, Latter-day Saints are very resilient, and so there's been some definite challenges that have caused us to stiffen up our backs as a people and to gain some resilience. And that's I don't know, you live in Salt Lake, John, and Mormons are a pretty resilient bunch of folks.
Oh yeah, I mean, I've noticed it. I can still, in conversations and relationships, pick up on a sense of resistance sometimes, especially if they don't know me, to having that conversation with evangelicals. But I can also sense that they've come a long way and that they understand that, hopefully we live in a new time and that we can have more positive relationships. And so I can sense that sense of resilience that's built up in Latter-day Saints.
Yep. And John, what about from your vantage point for evangelicals? Do you think that there's that same kind of dynamic for us?
I think so. I mean, I do wonder at times how far we have come. I do think we've got a ways to go in building up resilience. I can think you spoke to the past about the Scopes trial and the impact on our community. In my thinking, evangelicals still wrestle with it in a couple of areas. One would be our post 9/11 environment. If you look historically at the relationship between Christianity and evangelicalism and the Muslim world, there's been a tension there historically. I think that was made worse after 9/11. I think that worseness or that tension there continues to fester as a result of the ongoing so-called war on terror. So we need to work in that area. There's also the post-Christendom context of America, not post-Christian. We still have a sizable majority of evangelicals and other Christians in the United States, but it's post-Christendom. The church has moved away from the center and towards the margins of credibility and cultural influence, and I think evangelicals wrestle with not being at the center of the table. Now, I think the election of Trump has maybe caused some of that. Maybe they feel a little better with the number of white evangelicals who voted for Trump. But ultimately, I think we're still going to have to wrestle with a pluralistic environment with a number of different religious voices wanting to have a positive contribution to what does it mean to be in a country that is post-Christendom and where there are all these competing religious voices. So we're still dealing with that, I think, within evangelicalism.
And we've talked about how our movements have faced trauma and resilience in terms of larger forces historically, even up to present times. Let's deal specifically with our movement's engagement of one another, because there's been a lot of trauma involving evangelicals and Latter-day Saints. And so perhaps we could talk a little bit about that for starters. Ed, you've had some exposure in that regard, if you wanted to share a bit about that historically.
Yeah. Well, as a young missionary, I learned about Walter Martin. He attended his schooling at the Stony Brook School on Long Island, and I was a missionary back in that area. And so when I was a seminary teacher in Beaverton, Oregon, some of my seminary students told me that there was going to be somebody over at the Village Baptist Church in Beaverton who was going to be talking about Mormons on Tuesday night, and they wanted to go. And so I took my seminary students over to the Village Baptist Church, and on the way over, one of the students handed me a little brochure that said that it was Walter Martin who was going to be there that night. And of course, I knew who Walter Martin was, and I wondered whether I was taking my young seminary students to the right place. But as Walter Martin did what he always did, and John's very familiar with his tactics, and so he and I engaged in a debate when his discussion was over, and he told me that I wasn't representing the teachings of the Mormon Church correctly, that I was bearing false witness, if you will, and he threatened to sue me. And so there's been that kind of antagonism between our two communities, and it's been serious, very serious over time. And there's still residuals of that kind of feeling between Mormons and evangelicals.
Others, anecdotally, in terms of experiences that you can recall, and just even put it in larger historical context, if you wish, with the countercult movement and the like. John, I know you've had a lot of exposure to that.
Yeah, I used to work within the evangelical countercult community years ago. I worked for one of the major ministries as a part of that. I was even president of an umbrella organization that kind of helped guide these apologetic ministries. I almost went to work for Walter Martin's organization years and years ago, just before he died. He was kind of a cornerstone in creating the paradigm for which many evangelicals had understood how to relate to other religious groups, particularly groups like Mormons, this what we call the heresy rationalist apologetic. That is, we focus on, rather than they're another religious group we need to understand and relate to and have conversations, they were basically heresies that one has to refute and offer apologetic arguments and destroy their worldview, and then somehow the rationale is then they'll be open to our positive messages, evangelicals. And while that kind of reached its peak, I think maybe in the 1980s with films like The Godmakers and so on, it really has gone into decline with changes in evangelicalism and the culture, and you've started to see over the last 2 decades more of an openness to viewing other religious groups like Mormons less combatively and to engaging each other more in terms of not losing our understanding of differences, but saying, you know, we can engage each other and understand each other in less combative and apologetic kind of ways.
John's point, I think, points to a larger question for the modern world, and that is of pluralism and how to relate to the other, however the other is defined. And it's been particularly difficult with Latter-day Saints and evangelicals. I've argued in print that part of that difficulty has actually been proximity, not distance. Because it's one thing to relate to the exotic other that is so far removed that it's not too close for comfort in some ways.
It's not threatening, or not as much so.
Yeah, but it's different when we use similar terminology, when we share a commitment to the Old and New Testaments, when we invoke Jesus as a centerpiece of our worship and practice. Then we're kind of treading on each other's ground, as it were. And I think historically speaking, evangelicals and Mormons are a fascinating case study in the burden of pluralism. What if it's someone that's using your sacred language and your sacred texts in ways that you don't like? Then how do you relate? And I think that's if our two communities can figure out how to get past decades and decades of antagonism and suspicion and replace that somehow, I think that's a pretty good case study for religious pluralism in the modern world, period. Because we do tread on each other's sacred territory a lot. We do.
When you think about it, where, you know, historically when JFK was running for presidential office, you know, a lot of Protestants were deeply troubled the Pope was going to rule America.
Yeah.
So, you know, it used to be Protestant, you know, Protestant, Catholic, Jew. Then, you know, Mitt Romney, you know, running, and, you know, how would evangelicals position themselves? You know, do we support him? And then, you know, in another context, though he was mainline Protestant, Barack Obama, with the matter of, you know, his name, his origins, and people would say, well, he's not really a Christian, and, you know, is he a Muslim? And at some point we might have a Muslim president and such. And so those types of factors, not just religiously but politically, come into play, because the theocracy in America is always right around the corner, so to speak, in our mindset of city on a hill, so to speak. So trauma, resilience, proximity, the more proximity, the closer the proximity, the more the sense of trauma can occur, I think, with all of this.
Absolutely, and as you noted in the examples that you have, if it weren't for these painful histories internally for Protestants, between evangelicals and liberal Protestants, I think that played into some of the recent kind of political friction and tension, and
Absolutely.
Evangelicals and Latter-day Saints, without those painful histories, I don't think any of this would make sense.
Right.
But we're overcoming years and years and years of deeply entrenched misgivings about the other.
And as we deal with how to build more constructive forms of engagement, understanding the history is important. If we don't understand the history, we tend to repeat it, as Santayana would have said.
Yeah.
And I think for all of us, it is very complex terrain, and we have to be sensitive to it, even with dealing with the trauma in our own movements, because I shouldn't just think, get over it to people, because there's a lot of tape. There are a lot of tapes that people aren't even aware of playing in their heads and in their souls. And so I need to be more sensitive at times myself personally on these matters to my movement. So there have been positive steps taken. I think we've alluded a bit to it in terms of bridge building efforts that have occurred involving our movements. It's not all the counter-cult engagement or disengagement that we've had in so many contexts over the past, generation or generations. There have been attempts, and we've been involved in those gatherings in various ways, and I would assume, especially Spencer and John, given your context in Salt Lake and the like, but would you mind speaking to those issues of building connections, and we'll put it in the context of trauma and resilience as we proceed. Spencer and John?
Well, on my side, on the academic side, about the year 2000, some of my colleagues at Brigham Young University and some evangelical academics began a formal LDS evangelical dialogue group that has met twice a year for 17 years. And membership has changed over time, and the format's changed over time. But that's been a very positive step. Some initial kind of wariness of each other has turned into relationships that are actually remarkable. They've guest lectured in my courses. I've been to their universities and given lectures in their courses, and we've been to each other's churches. This has been a remarkable set of relationships. We've hosted evangelical student groups at Brigham Young University at times, from mostly schools in the West, but from the Midwest as well, and had our students interact in ways that are much healthier than have been in the past. And we've hosted evangelical leaders on campus and in the community as well. Ravi Zacharias' visit to Salt Lake City was a notable example of this. Al Mohler to Brigham Young University. We hosted the General Superintendent of the Assemblies of God in Salt Lake City. Hosted him, had a wonderful time with him. The executive board of the National Association of Evangelicals met in Salt Lake City, and LDS church leaders and academics were a part of that exchange, and it was meaningful on both sides. So there are recent examples of really positive exchanges, at least at the academic level, but that's gone other places as well.
Yeah, it's not just the academic level. On a grassroots level, in 2004, I was one of the co-editors of a book called Encountering New Religious Movements, and it basically put forward a new paradigm for evangelicals. It said we don't have to engage the other as heresy, engage solely in apologetic refutation. It really used kind of a cross-cultural missions model. It said, look, why don't we look at them as other religious cultures? And just like a missionary going overseas, we try and understand their worldview and their language and how they live and what's important to them, and relate to them and build relationships. We can do the same kind of things with Mormons and members of other religious groups. And we won the Christianity Today Book of the Year award for that book in the category of missions and global affairs. I've been privileged to be a part of this grant initiative where we have discovered case studies of churches throughout the United States engaging others in their religious communities in positive ways. So on a grassroots level as well as the academic, evangelicals have made great strides in more civil forms of engagement.
I think it's also quite striking, John, that you're the custodian for the Evangelical Chapter of the Foundation for Religious Diplomacy, and there you were working with a Mormon leader, Charles Randall Paul.
Yeah.
And so, he oversees the whole organization.
Exactly. Yeah, the Foundation for Religious Diplomacy, founded by Randy Paul. He approached me as a Latter-day Saint and had this commitment to religious diplomacy, working through our differences and our commitments rather than around them. And we shared a similar mindset, and he said, you're an evangelical, and we have chapters in different religious traditions. Would you consider heading that venture for the evangelical? So here you have a Latter-day Saint and an evangelical and members of other religious traditions working together. Not that we agree on the doctrine and so on. We have very different concepts of that, but we're committed to a diplomatic way of engaging each other.
So Ed, if you could speak to it as well, because you've been really, a trailblazer in this regard in the greater Portland area, really trying to build these connections. It's not just happening in Salt Lake, it's not just happening in Pasadena and in Denver, Colorado, and elsewhere. It's also something that you have been really passionate about, and I've really appreciated your initiatives of reaching out to pastors and others. We've connected for years and have built this really vital relationship. Well, why don't you speak to it from your vantage point, please?
Yeah. Well, it's been challenging, and it's been encouraging and disappointing at the same time, because we've had some successes and some failures. But one of the things I think that's been the most important that I've learned recently from the kind of engagements that Spencer's been talking about is the relationships that have been created between Latter-day Saints and evangelicals, where I know that Spencer has said that he hopes that when he's talking about the evangelical community, that John, you and Paul, that you would recognize yourself in what Spencer was saying about you. And we would like to be able to feel the same way. And there's been books written together by Latter-day Saints and evangelical scholars. The one in particular that I've been reading lately, Gerald Dermott, a brilliant evangelical theologian, has developed a very close relationship with a very fine Latter-day Saint theologian. And Mr. Dermott has come out, even though there's still serious differences in some of our points of theology, he has come to the defense of the LDS teachings and in writing, and it's been a courageous thing for him to do, to actually say that, hey, over the years we've thought this about what Mormons believe with respect to salvation by grace alone, the subject we're going to be talking about tonight, and he has said that what he's said about the church, he hopes was going to change the attitude of the evangelical community with respect to that one particular doctrine. Not that there aren't still some areas even with that where we have some differences, but that we've made some serious progress, and I'm real happy about that, and I'm looking forward to, Paul, the things that you and I can do in the future to continue to engage with the local community.
So this theme of trauma and resilience manifests itself in a variety of ways. We've talked about it in terms of the history of the movement or movements. We've talked about how we position ourselves in relationship to the broader culture in the context of 9/11 or increasing pluralism of many religions, secularism alike, and how that can cause trauma. We also have talked about how there's been trauma involving our communities, and we're seeking to build resilience, so to speak, in terms of building civility and the like, bridging the gap. And there have been some successes, but as you have said, Ed, there's also been some disappointments along the way. I think one of the issues, and I know that John has had some interaction with a sociologist or a social psychologist dealing with this theme of moral intuitions, Jonathan Haidt, and dealing with honoring your own tradition, or some might call it tribe, in terms of their moral foundations, their affections, their moral intuitions, that you've been encouraged, John, as you engage more broadly in multi-faith discourse, interfaith discourse, make sure that those closest to you in terms of evangelicalism don't think that you're suspect, because you'll lose everything if, to use my language here, if they come away traumatized, that, you know, you're really a sheep, but not really a sheep, you're a wolf in sheep's clothing, right? And I think that you've had to be sensitive that while building resilience, of building bridges with people of all different religious traditions and spiritual orientations, including Latter-day Saints, that while doing that, you're still loyal to your own community. So how do we engage where we are building resilience in terms of these exchanges, but at the same time not causing trauma or reducing as much trauma as we can, where fellow Latter-day Saints, also evangelicals, don't think that we've in a sense jeopardized the distinctives of our respective traditions. John, if we could start with you, because I know that you've had to think through that in terms of this other work that we're doing with this Louisville Institute grant, and then FRD as well, if you wouldn't mind, and then we'll go to Spencer and Ed.
Yeah, that is one of the huge challenges. In fact, I literally have been called a wolf in sheep's clothing with exactly that.
And that wasn't by me,
on
John.
the internet. No, it was by other evangelicals. But that's one of the challenges in that we want to be prophetic in a sense in our religious communities. You know, the Old Testament prophets were a part of the nation of Israel, and yet at the same time they had to bring prophetic critique to what does it mean to follow God in our context. And if the prophet gets too far ahead of the people, then they lose credibility, they're an outsider. So for us, I think what we have to do is always send signals to our religious community. I'm a good evangelical, I'm a good Latter-day Saint. Yet at the same time, I want to bring helpful critique that we can relate to people in other religious traditions in different ways that are more positive and yet still be faithful evangelicals in the process. And whether it's the tools of social psychology or what have you, there are a variety of tools that we can draw upon that maintains that difficult balance of saying, yes, I'm the insider, I can be trusted, but at the same time, I have some critique I think we can do better along the way, maintaining that balance.
Mm. This makes me think about a very basic human need that relates to your theme, and that is the need to be understood and to be heard. And the 19th century version of that for Latter-day Saints was to stand on a corner and tell people the message, and they may or may not have been listening, but maybe on some level you felt heard. You were saying words and people were around. But the most satisfying times for me to be heard and understood by people outside my tribe exist in a relationship that has been patiently built over time. And I think those relationships take work. They're not, a media 30-second blurb doesn't accomplish that. I may or may not be heard or understood. I may just Twitter. They're not conducive. What it takes are patient conversations, maybe some misunderstandings, some working through some. Where do we meet and where can't we meet? Right. Where are we never going to meet on this or that issue? And being candid, open. But over time, those relationships are the most satisfying because you really are heard and you really are understood. We have a leader in the LDS tradition by the name of Boyd K. Packer. He was one of our apostles, passed away somewhat recently. And he said, the longer I live, the less I'm even concerned about being believed, but being understood. I just want to be understood. I want to make sure that and I think he expressed a kind of universal truth there about being a human being, that there's a part of all of us who wants to be understood, especially with something as intimate as a faith journey for each of us. Why is Paul an evangelical? Why am I a Latter-day Saint? When we drill through that, we more often than not, at least in my experience, I've found a friend. I've found a fellow traveler. I'm not going to become an evangelical anytime soon. I don't think Paul's going to become a Latter-day Saint anytime soon. He knows Ed well enough to know the message, right? But if we take that amount of investment to actually be understood, those relationships are enriching outside the tribe, and I think that's kind of what I'm after.
Yeah. Excellent.
Here's what I think. I think that there comes a point in time that institutionally there's going to have to be something, maybe a bit of a letting go and trusting in the validity of the claims that you're making. And eventually the truth is what sets you free. And we, as leaders in our communities, we don't want to try to protect our people so much that they don't open themselves up to learning. And if we have confidence in our message and in the truth, then we will be willing to. Well, Spencer, you were saying that there's some leaders of the church that have thought, well, at BYU, do we want to bring evangelical folks to BYU and take the chance of influencing the young Latter-day Saints who are there that may not be prepared? Well, if that's the attitude that's had at the leadership levels in these communities, then we're never going to be able to get together and really talk. But the friendships that have been made, and like with Paul and I have a lot of confidence in my faith and what I believe, and I know that you do too, Paul, and I'm not afraid to tell you what I think, and you're not afraid to tell me what you think. And somehow or another, we've got to convince the leaders of our communities that it's time to be a little resilient and have some confidence in our faith, that we'll open up and engage in these kinds of things and learn from one another.
And I think it's quite striking that if you really want to build resilience in a community, if you have no exposure to other groups, you don't gain resilience.
Exactly.
So, you know, I know that I've had to share this with others in my community, and we're talking about more broadly other traditions, you know, even outside of Christendom, where, you know, if it's Hinduism, like, they don't want me to have students engage there. And I'm thinking, well, if they never have exposure, how are they ever going to engage where they build resilience as Christians? They have nothing to, in a sense, push up against in a gracious way, but to really wrestle through things. And I think that that's important. And also, like you said, trust. And back to what Spencer had said about, you know, whether or not I'm believed, am I understood? And I think with security, you know, there's that prayer attributed to St. Francis of Assisi, whether or not he ever prayed it, but it really sounds like him, you know, to understand even more, to be understood. If I'm secure, I will hopefully want to understand someone. And I agree so much with that matter of, you know, I want to be understood. And I think bound up with that is also, do I really care to understand Latter-day Saints? Do I care to understand Roman Catholics and Buddhists and other, or am I only wanting to make sure that I'm presenting my case and, you know, just, you know, wanting you to come over and I'm an evangelist. I mean, I think we're all evangelists for our tradition. We're not trying to compromise. And I think I also have to, and this is sometimes harder for me, because I'm thinking, we should know better. Why are we so afraid? But I have to have more patience than I do for people in my own movement, because that security is not there for many. And they often, sometimes the largest speakers and the most forthright and forceful speakers on these matters, and those who condemn, are often the most insecure.
Exactly.
And I think that I need to have patience, and I have to sometimes take the log out of my own eye before I take the splinter out of someone else's, that I have some self-righteousness I have to deal with, and maybe I don't have insecurity in some ways with you, but maybe I have my own insecurities with them, because I have pain of trauma with them pushing back at me. And so I think the trauma resilience shows up in so many contexts, and I need to make sure I'm not leaving them behind while building this, and I need to be more patient, more filled with the Spirit to engage them, so that maybe we all can come together to interact, not to discard our convictions, but to work through our convictions, not go around them, not to stop short, but to really go through them, to really engage one another. I'm really grateful for Spencer and Ed and John taking the time to dialogue on this subject of trauma and resilience in terms of our engagement of our diverse religious and spiritual traditions. I have a lot of hope. I have a hope that we'll go further into our respective traditions, but also in such a way that we're expansive to engage others in grace and truth. I think that we would all agree when we think of Jesus Christ, as John 1:14 says, the Word became flesh and made his dwelling in our midst, and we have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. And we're called to live in grace and truth and to engage one another in grace and truth. And as we become more secure in who we are before God, we will become more civil, not to discard our convictions, but to engage robustly in this kind of discourse, to move through trauma, to move beyond trauma, to increase in our resilience as followers of our respective paths, and in such a way that we really do meet and build bridges. And we're in Bridgetown, or in the Bridgetown area, Portland, and it's all about building bridges. I just want to see more evangelical and Mormon or Latter-day Saint dialogue that involves building these bridges. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.